They didn't get lost. They didn't get caught in a storm they weren't prepared for. Their tent was cut open, from the inside, and 9 people ran out into temperatures of roughly -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, most of them without proper coats or boots. This is one of the only cases in modern history where investigators had photographs, diaries, and a documented timeline right up to the final hours. And it still isn't solved. 9 hikers. February 1959. The northern Ural Mountains, in what was then the Soviet Union. This is what actually happened, as far as anyone has ever been able to prove. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a radio engineering student and experienced ski hiker. The trip was organized through the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club, and it was rated Grade 3, the most difficult classification in the Soviet hiking system at the time. This wasn't a casual outing. Every member of the group had real winter mountaineering experience, several had completed comparable routes before, and this specific route, toward a mountain called Otorten, had been planned and approved through normal channels. 10 people set out. One of them, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a documented, unremarkable decision that ended up saving his life, and one of the reasons we know as much about the group's final days as we do, since he was able to describe their condition and mood right up until he left them. The remaining 9 kept going: Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. Their diaries and photographs survived, and they're worth mentioning because of how ordinary they are. There's nothing in them that reads like foreshadowing. No sense of dread, no arguments, no signs of fear. Entries describe songs around camp, the usual discomforts of a winter route, photographs of the group joking around, building a snow shelter, packing gear. The people who study this case closely aren't looking at 9 people who sensed something coming. They're looking at 9 people who had an ordinary evening, and then didn't. By February 1st, the group had reached the slope of a peak called Kholat Syakhl. In the local Mansi language, this name has often been translated in popular retellings as Dead Mountain, a translation that gets repeated constantly because it sounds ominous, but the more literal and commonly cited translation is closer to Mountain of the Dead in the sense of a barren, lifeless peak, not a place with any specific prior tragedy tied to the name. It's worth being precise about that, because it's one of the smaller details that's been inflated over the decades into something it isn't. What is genuinely unresolved is why the group set up camp on that open slope at all, instead of continuing down to the shelter of the treeline, which had been the original plan. The standard explanations are poor visibility, fatigue after a long day, or a navigational error in worsening conditions. No definitive answer exists. It's a small decision that, in hindsight, put them somewhere with almost no natural protection from whatever came next. They pitched the tent, settled in for the night. That's the last confirmed, documented moment of all 9 of them alive. The group had arranged to send a telegram once they returned to a nearby settlement, expected around February 12. When no telegram arrived, the initial reaction was muted. Delays on expeditions like this weren't unusual, and nobody panicked right away. It took several more days, and mounting pressure from worried families, before a formal search effort was organized. Beginning around February 20, volunteers, fellow students, and eventually military and police units were mobilized, searching by air and on the ground across difficult, remote terrain in continuing winter conditions. This was not a fast or easy search. The area was genuinely hard to access, and the group had been overdue long enough that everyone involved understood the odds were already bad. On February 26, searchers found the tent. It was partially collapsed under snow, on the open slope of Kholat Syakhl, exactly where the group had pitched it. Skis and poles that had been used as tent supports were still in place. Personal belongings, clothing, food, boots, were still inside. The tent itself had multiple cuts in the fabric. Later examination of the direction and nature of the tears indicated the cuts had been made from the inside out. Whatever made 9 trained, experienced hikers leave a warm tent in sub-zero temperatures without their boots happen fast enough that they didn't stop to get properly dressed. It did not happen fast enough that they didn't stop to cut their way out, instead of taking the extra seconds to unzip the door. Searchers found footprints leading away from the tent, down the slope, toward the treeline roughly 1.5 kilometers away. Some were bare feet. Some were in socks, or a single layer of thin clothing. Based on the spacing between prints, the footprints were initially assessed as consistent with people walking, not running in a panic scramble, though this detail has been debated and re-examined in later analyses of the physical evidence, and isn't treated as fully settled. The search team followed that trail down toward the trees, not yet knowing what they were walking toward. The first two bodies were found near a large cedar tree at the edge of the tree line, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were in minimal clothing, near the remains of a small fire, which suggests they had tried to keep warm rather than continue moving once they reached the trees. At the cedar itself, searchers found broken branches extending up to a significant height on the trunk, evidence that one or both men had climbed it, possibly trying to see back toward the tent, or the slope above, in the dark. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were found in positions that suggested they had been trying to make their way back uphill when they died: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Slobodin's remains showed a skull fracture serious enough that it could plausibly have been incapacitating on its own, though it wasn't conclusively identified as the direct cause of death at the time. Those 5 bodies were recovered by the end of February. The remaining 4 weren't found until early May, almost 2 months later, because of how deep the snow cover had become. They were located in a ravine roughly 75 meters from the cedar tree, under several meters of snow, well after the spring thaw had begun to shift the terrain. The final 4, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, had injuries that are, to this day, the central unresolved question of the entire case. The examining pathologist described severe chest and skull injuries comparable in force to what you'd expect from a car crash. And yet there was no corresponding external soft tissue damage, no bruising, no obvious blunt force wound pattern that would typically accompany trauma of that severity from a fall or an impact with an object. There is no car. There was nothing on that slope that should have hit them like one. One additional detail from the final 4 has fueled decades of speculation, and it deserves to be stated carefully. Dubinina was missing her tongue, along with some other soft tissue. Forensic reviewers in the years since have largely attributed this to natural postmortem decomposition and small animal scavenging, given that her body had been recovered from a running stream under snow for an extended period, conditions that accelerate exactly this kind of tissue loss. But at the time, and in early reporting on the case, this detail was presented without that context, and it's a significant part of why this case took on the reputation it has. There's also the matter of radiation. Traces of radioactive contamination were found on the clothing of some of the victims, a real, documented laboratory finding, not a later addition to the story. The range of proposed explanations includes lantern mantles that, at the time, commonly contained thoriated material some hikers used for equipment, and separately, workplace exposure connected to at least one victim's job. No single source was ever conclusively confirmed, and this remains one of the case's genuinely open threads. The official cause of death listed for 4 of them was severe internal trauma with no significant external injury. One investigator later compared the force involved to what you'd expect from a car crash. There was no car. The original 1959 Soviet inquiry closed the case citing a compelling natural force as the cause of death. That phrase was intentionally vague, and it stayed vague for over 60 years, not because investigators were hiding something dramatic, but because that's genuinely as far as the evidence available to them at the time could take them. The case was officially closed within a few months of the search concluding, and much of the original file remained restricted for decades afterward, which only added fuel to the speculation that followed. The theory taken most seriously by contemporary researchers today involves avalanche science. In 2019 and again in more detailed form in 2021, researchers used modern snow slab modeling, published in the journal Communications Earth and Environment, to propose that a small, delayed slab avalanche struck the tent's location. The mechanics matter here. This wouldn't have looked like the large, visible avalanche most people picture. A slab avalanche of the type modeled could have released hours after the tent was cut into the slope, triggered by a combination of terrain angle, wind loading of snow, and the disturbance of digging into the slope itself. The model also addressed the injury pattern. Slab avalanches, unlike a person being struck by falling rock or a blunt object, can produce severe internal trauma from a wide, distributed weight impact without leaving the kind of concentrated external bruising you'd expect from a smaller, harder object. It's a serious piece of research, done by people with real expertise in snow mechanics, and it's the closest thing the case has to a scientifically modeled explanation. It also has real, acknowledged limitations. Critics point out that no avalanche debris was documented by the original search teams, who were on that slope within weeks of the incident and photographed it extensively. The terrain itself is also atypical for the kind of slab avalanche being modeled. It isn't the steep, classic avalanche-prone slope you'd expect. And the theory, even in its strongest form, doesn't fully account for every detail in the case: why the group moved as far as they did, roughly 1.5 kilometers to the tree line, rather than sheltering closer to the damaged tent if the threat was avalanche-related and not ongoing. Other explanations have been proposed and taken seriously to varying degrees over the decades, and it's worth naming them plainly rather than picking a favorite. One is katabatic wind, a localized, powerful downslope wind phenomenon that can occur in certain mountain terrain, capable of producing sustained, violent gusts strong enough to cause a tent to feel structurally unsafe, potentially explaining a rapid, panicked exit without an avalanche at all. This theory struggles somewhat to account for the specific injury pattern on the final 4 bodies. Another is infrasound, the theory that certain wind conditions moving across specific terrain shapes can generate low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, which in some research contexts have been associated with feelings of panic, nausea, or disorientation. It's a real, studied phenomenon in acoustics, though its application to this specific case remains speculative rather than demonstrated. There is also, inevitably, a military test theory, the idea that the group witnessed or was affected by some kind of weapons or rocket testing in the area, given the Cold War context and the region's proximity to restricted military zones. This theory has never been substantiated with declassified documentation, and most researchers who've reviewed the available Soviet-era records consider it unproven, though it remains a persistent thread in popular retellings of the case, partly because of how genuinely restricted much of the original investigation file was for so long. A separate line of explanation focuses on paradoxical undressing, a documented phenomenon in advanced hypothermia cases, where the body's temperature regulation system fails in a way that causes a person in the late stages of hypothermia to feel intensely, mistakenly hot, sometimes leading them to remove clothing shortly before death. This is real, clinically documented behavior, and it's been used to explain why some of the victims were found with clothing removed or unfastened, though it doesn't address the initial reason the group left the tent in the first place. None of these theories, including the avalanche model, has achieved full consensus. Each accounts for some of the evidence and struggles with other parts of it. That's not a failure of investigation. It's the honest state of a case where the only 9 people who could answer the central question didn't survive to be asked it. What's actually known, without dispute, is this: 9 experienced, well-equipped hikers cut their way out of a secure tent, in extreme cold, without adequate clothing, and moved roughly 1.5 kilometers down a slope toward tree cover. Some died of hypothermia near a fire they tried to build. Some died attempting to return to the tent. 4 died of severe internal trauma with no clear external cause, in a ravine nearly 2 months' worth of snowfall away from where the search began. The case was reopened by Russian authorities in 2019, more than 60 years after it closed, specifically to formally examine the avalanche theory using modern methods, itself a sign of how unresolved this remains in the eyes of the people with the most direct access to the original evidence. Their conclusion, released after that renewed investigation, supported avalanche and associated exposure as the most likely cause, but even that official conclusion has not ended the broader debate among independent researchers, and it hasn't addressed every specific detail that's troubled investigators since 1959. There is a memorial marker near the pass today, and a mountain pass in the area has since been informally named after the group. Family members of some of the hikers have spoken publicly, over the years, about wanting the case treated with the seriousness the evidence deserves, not as a piece of internet folklore, but as what it actually is: 9 real people, with real families, whose deaths still don't have a fully agreed-upon explanation more than 6 decades later. That's the honest answer to what happened at Dyatlov Pass. Not a monster, not a curse, not a cover-up with a tidy final reveal. A slope, a tent cut open from the inside, a set of injuries science still argues about, and 9 names that deserve to be remembered as more than a mystery.